Hello, my name is Andrew Bonthius. I teach history here at Cuyahoga Community College at the Metro campus in Cleveland, Ohio. And welcome to Deep Layered Change in History, Part 2. In this session, I want to take you step by step through the making of a deep layered change arc using a history textbook. In this case, we're going to use Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty, his third AP edition. And in addition, what I'd like to do is follow up on the use of hash marks as you would find on a normal traditional timeline, and also talk about mini deep layered changes, two things I mentioned towards the end of the last video, part 1. Okay, so I have chosen, let's review the criteria of deep layered change here first. It has only approximate beginning and ending dates, that is to say no full date with a day, month, and year. It can take place over several years, decades, centuries, millennia, or up to billions of years. It can be about any socioeconomic, political, cultural, environmental, or technological change of lasting significance, and it involves masses of people as well as leaders. And by the way, just as a reminder, when I'm testing students on this material, I usually ask them to memorize this as well as then learn to apply it in class and in history. I like to emphasize that they really shouldn't play around with the wording too much here. There are some very key words here, some of which I've underlined, that they can't leave out. They must appear when they are writing down what the 4 criteria are of deep layered changes. So, for instance, they could say that it takes place over several years or up to billions of years. They don't have to mention decades, centuries, millennia, but they do have to be inclusive rather than exclusive. So if they leave out if they just say several years and billions of years, that's wrong. They have to say several years or up to billions of years. That would be inclusive of decades, centuries, millennia. Very often students will get number 1 wrong, and they'll say it has no specific dates. Well, that's true, but that's not enough. That's the negative. We want the positive definition. It has only approximate beginning and ending dates. Sometimes students will say it has no dates. Well, that's clearly wrong. With number 3, they don't have to say every single one of these or write every single one, political, cultural, economic, and technological. They could say it involves or can be about socioeconomic as well as technological and political change. They don't have to mention all of them, but they don't want to be exclusive and say something like it's only about socioeconomic and political change. And of course, they must have of lasting significance. If that's left out, then I consider it wrong. Students will often just say for number 4, it involves masses of people, and they'll forget to say leaders or one or the other. You've got to have both. Okay, so again, for this session, I've chosen the Civil War, as I finished up with in the last part 1. You'll notice, though, a little bit of difference in the title. Last time I used development of, and in this case I'm using evolution of. And I've put some images here, and I want to come back to these images because they're very carefully chosen, you might already note. Let me refresh your memory that the titles of deep layered change arcs must have a key word or phrase in them. And this time I've chosen to use evolution of. I think that works equally well as development of. Other key phrases would be the change in, demise of, transition from and to, so from Paleolithic to Neolithic age if you're doing world history, or from the American history from agricultural barter subsistence economy to the market economy. One thing, though, I think you can choose incorrect keywords. So for this deep layered change arc on the Civil War, I would not accept the age of the Civil War. That would be wrong. It's just not long enough for an age. So I think there are cases in which some keywords would not be appropriate. And again, note here that without such a key word or phrase in the title, the arc is not labeled correctly. And for grading purposes, I usually attach 2 points to each of the points in the arc, except point 4 is generally 1 point. But 2 points for each of 1, 2, and 3. If they don't have a correct or have left out a keyword or phrase for their title, that's 1 point off. I like to choose wars because wars appear to be in contradiction to the very first criterion of deep layer changes, and that is that they're not supposed to have any specific beginning or ending date. And of course, we know all wars do, as pictured here with the firing on Fort Sumter by the Confederates and the surrender of the Confederates at Appomattox Courthouse and the signing of the treaty. Those happened on very fixed dates, April 12th for the firing on Sumter, and for the cessation of hostilities, April 9th, 1865. But, as somebody once said, wars are simply politics by other means. And therefore, with that understanding, we have to look to the political origins of the Civil War. And how far back do we need to go to identify when it could be clearly determined in the historical narrative that the issue of slavery would only be settled through force of arms and bloody conflict. I also wanted to choose this same deep layer change arc because you will see that in my point 3 this time, I'm going to do a different ending date than I did in part 1. And that is because that demonstrates that I tell students that there can be more than one correct answer as long as it's soundly grounded in the historical narrative. If you recall the last deep layer change arc in the Civil War, I ended point 3 with the mid-late 1860s and the Civil War amendments as part of Reconstruction. This time you'll see we're going to go a little farther. It is possible to set an incorrect beginning or ending date. So for instance, with the beginning date of the Civil War, a student might say, well, aren't the origins of the Civil War really back even in colonial America, where we can see the sectional differences already developing with cash crops being grown in the South and socioeconomic differences clearly differentiating themselves from North to South? And for a deep layer change on the Civil War, I would say that's a little too early. We're looking for the first time, the earliest times when we see clearly that the sectional differences are resulting in armed conflict that will then lead to the Civil War. So in terms of establishing our beginning time frame. And I have not changed that this time. I've maintained the same beginning time frame, approximate time frame for this deep layer change arc as being the mid 1850s. So let's go over here to the overhead camera, and this is how I would do it in class. Let's transfer this to a piece of paper. Students can just do this on a piece of paper at their desk. And I often just guide the entire class through the drawing of deep layer change arc. So we're going to put down the evolution of the U.S. Civil War. And again, there's the key word, must be there. Okay, now for point 2 and using the text, in Foner's book on page 511 here, we see him, I'll zoom in here, go from a mention of restored sectional peace and party unity in 1850 to the next paragraph where we already are experiencing in 1854, he says here, this copy is not very good, it's shaded, but he says in 1854, the old political order finally succumbed to the disruptive pressures of sectionalism. Okay, so right there, we can, remember all points on the arc must have a brief description, substantive description or descriptors. Okay, so we're going to put down political order, succumbed to disruptive pressures of sectionalism. Okay. Now, continuing on, same page, and the next few lines, he talks about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which sent shockwaves through the nation because it overturned the Missouri Compromise, which said there would be no slavery above 3630, the southern border of Missouri. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is 1854. So we could put that down here as a brief descriptor as to why the Civil War begins. And we could actually put it down as the Bleeding Kansas period. Begins. And so here we have our first armed, well, some of our first armed conflict, if you're not counting all the times that people have attempted to free slaves from slave catchers. There had certainly been other conflicts between pro and anti-slave forces, but Bleeding Kansas is really the Civil War in microcosm, beginning in Kansas there. Okay, so we move on through the text. And one thing you want to point out to students is that discerning deep layered change requires what we call a close reading of the text. So here on this page in 511, Foner mentions 1854, the political order succumbs to sectional tensions. But over here on the next page, well, on page 513, I should say, up here he gives a nice approximate range of time here. The mid-1850s, he mentions that the disruptive impact of slavery on the traditional parties was the immediate cause of the political transformation in the mid-1850s. So we have political transformation and breakdown of traditional parties. Remember, the Republican Party is formed in 1854. Now, I've sort of run out of room here, but there are many other brief descriptors that would work here, and you as the instructor need to decide how much you're going to require for assignment purposes and for grading purposes here. But I usually require a couple different substantive points to be made down here. I do accept fragments and phrases. I don't require that they be done in complete sentences here. One of the tricks, though, in getting this concept across is to make sure that students connect that these descriptors down here are congruent with their title. Very often students will not be putting relevant information down here on their points 2 and 3. Now there's a lot more that we could put down here. Okay, we could put down the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Specifically, we could mention it that way instead of just Bleeding Kansas. Here, he mentions that the cat and the Industrial Revolution was spreading rapidly. Okay, so that could be put down there for number 2. Another one on page 519, where he sort of finishes up. Foner notes that one political party had been destroyed, in the Whigs, and then another one's seriously weakened, and a new one had risen, the Republicans, devoted entirely to the interests of the North. That could be a descriptor here, down in point 2. That the Republican Party was entirely representative of Northern interests at this point in time. A last one. The failure of Buchanan, President Buchanan's administration. Foner references his disastrous failure of the Buchanan administration in dealing with sectional tensions. So that also could be put down here. All right, so moving on to the approximate point 3. When does it approximately end? Again, students must put down approximate. And what do we read in Foner? Well, we go to page 618, and we read that the North's commitment to Reconstruction had waned. So we could write down that here. North's commitment, and I'll abbreviate here, Reconstruction waned. Let's continue reading. Let's go to the next page, 619. That the Greeley campaign, now this would be early 1870s. Greeley's campaign placed in the Northern agenda, on the Northern agenda, the one issue on which the liberal reformers and Democrats would agree, and that is a new policy towards the South. And as we know, that new policy would be that there was no interest in expanding black freedom in any way, or social economic equality for black people. That the parameters of black equality, the parameters of freedom for black people would end with the simple abolition of formal chattel slavery. After that, the Southern racists would be in control. Down here, he's got resurgence of racism in the North. And this is all in the early to mid 1870s. So we could put down resurgence of
off the screen.
Racism in the North. And again, we're running out of room. There's quite a bit more. We've got room, looks like, for one more descriptor. If we move to page 620, we've got at the top here, Republicans were in no mood to devote further attention to the South. Here, a little farther down, the Northern public was retreating from Reconstruction. And here's a good one that we could put down that sort of puts a nail in the coffin of Reconstruction. Democrats, and that would be racist Redeemer Democrats in the South, had regained control of the states. And then farther up here, I didn't underline it, but he mentions, I believe, that the Democrats had also taken control of Congress for the first time since the Civil War, right here. The first time since the Civil War, the party, meaning the Democrats, took control of the House of Representatives. So racist Democrats are in control of Congress and states by the mid-1870s. And you'll note that he mentions the mid-1870s right here. Again, a very nice, fuzzy, approximate, deep layered change kind of date. So that's what we're going to use. We're going to, now farther down, he talks about in Mississippi, the Democrats launching a wave of intimidation against black officials and liberal Republican Democrats as well. Well, the one we definitely should have put, because this is a very traditional and I think correct marker for the final nail in the coffin of Reconstruction, which is the corrupt bargain of 1877, the Tilden Hayes affair, where the Southern Democrats give the White House to Hayes in return for control of the South and a few other perks. So we should definitely put that here. I just have room for bargain. Oh, sorry. Bargain of 1877. You might add corrupt bargain of 1877. So again, it's up to you as the instructor to determine how much substance you're going to require, how many points, and what you'll accept. But again, at a minimum, they have to be, in terms of quantity, that's your call. But in terms of substance, of course, they have to relate to this ending, this evolution of the Civil War. Now, why do we say so? Well, I forgot to put it in here. So we've got to put approximately mid, and I'm going to add late, 1870s. Okay, sorry, this is a little messy here, but mid to late 1870s is going to be the approximate ending date here. And you'll notice farther down here, and this is an excellent paragraph to help students develop powers of critical thinking powers and powers of discernment here as to what exactly authors are referring to. Notice Foner says, as a historical process, the nation's adjustment to the destruction of slavery, that is, Reconstruction, continued well after 1877. Blacks could vote and in some states hold office into the 1890s. But as a distinct national history, when Republicans controlled much of the South, exercised significant political power, and the federal government the responsibility for protecting the fundamental rights of all Americans, Reconstruction had come to an end. Okay? Very clearly stated there. Now, some students might say, well, wait a second, isn't Foner being contradictory here? He's saying Reconstruction ended here, but up here he says Reconstruction continued well after 1877. How do we explain that apparent contradiction? Well, I might have chosen to add the word elements of Reconstruction. But clearly he's explained himself in here that elements of Reconstruction continued on. But what dominated the South was no longer a Reconstruction mentality, but that the vestiges of Reconstruction continued on and were certainly by the late 19th century were all but over with. Okay, so there we've completed point 3 of the arc. Now there's one other part that we must do, and that is point 4, where we figure out and I usually have them draw lines, the approximate total years that this period covers, the evolution of the Civil War. And again, students must write approximate total years. Now, you might ask, well, how do you subtract approximate fuzzy ranges like this? Well, here you do have to decide to fish or cut bait on a date. So I'm going to take 1854, in 1877 and get, 1854, and we get what? 23 years total, okay? 23 years. Now, all right, so we could fill in all sorts of hash marks here if we wanted to. The force acts, in the 1870s. Of course, the corrupt bargain here would be over the far extreme right. The corrupt bargain of 1877. Tilden Hayes. Corrupt bargain. Okay. Now, so that's how you would fill out the arc with the hash marks. Now, as for mini deep layer changes, well, there was something called that Foner refers to as as presidential reconstruction during President Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln. So he says that's a couple years. So we could write, then use these brackets like this to indicate presidential reconstruction by Andrew Johnson. You could do the entire period of Reconstruction, beginning approximately with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was certainly the first shot over the South to reconstruct it by eliminating chattel slavery. So you could start with 1863, and you could do a bracket all the way down that includes to the end, to the end of the arc where the corrupt bargain was struck. So we have, and then label that Reconstruction period. So the way that you indicate these mini deep layer changes is through a bracket from beginning to end and then labeling them. Now mini, this seems like not so mini. Mini doesn't really reference the size. It just references that it's smaller than the arc itself. It's a time frame that's something less than the entire time frame. That's all mini deep layered refers to. You could do mini deep layered change for Bleeding Kansas, 1854 to 1856 approximately. Okay. All right. That pretty much concludes the this deep layered change arc. And as you can see, again, I want to remind you that this point 3, these substantive comments here differ quite a bit from the point 3 descriptors that I used in the last video. And again, that underscores the point that there can be more than one correct answer. I believe both were correct because both deep layer change arcs, the point 3s, took the Civil War past the official ending date. And that the Civil War was really not just about the physical violence, but it was about what the parameters of freedom would be for black people, essentially. And that struggle went way past the signing of the treaty, the peace treaty at Appomattox. So I want to go back now to these images here that I chose and point out, some of you may have already noted, that what I have here are the traditional fixed dates represented, with the firing on Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861, and the Appomattox, a scene here at the Appomattox Courthouse and the surrender of Lee to the Union. Here we have images reflecting the deep layered change dates, you'll notice. So we have John Brown and referencing and symbolizing the Bleeding Kansas period. He was one of the early proponents, along with William Seward and others, and Frederick Douglass, who said that slavery is an irrepressible conflict. It will not be resolved without bloodshed. And then here we have in the middle this iconic poster representing the degradation that blacks would suffer under Reconstruction as the North's commitment to black equality faded and was turned away to other matters. Now, it's important to emphasize to students that discerning deep layered change in the text requires what we call a close reading, very careful reading. And part of that, one of the things that means is that information that they'll need is spread throughout the chapter in different pages. It's not to be found in any one particular page or any one particular paragraph. And that they should look for approximate dates as clues to finding their deep layer change information and date ranges. They will find, you can tell the students this, that they will find that there are probably as many approximate deep layer change kind of dates in any given text as there are fixed dates. And in terms of presenting and executing the deep layer change arc itself, that phrases are acceptable as brief descriptions for points 2 and 3 of the arc. Now, there are multiple possible ways to use deep layer change, the arc, as for learning, for assignments. One is through group work. This could be done in groups. Probably no more than 3 or 4 would be good. You could set it up as a jigsaw exercise as well. That's just a reference to having groups of students take different parts of the same arc and all contributing to one deep layer change arc. So you'd have some students doing part 2, you'd have other students doing part 3, maybe another group doing the title and the total approximate years, and then coming together and discussing and debating the information that they've come up with. Or you could just assign a group with a particular deep layer change. They could be done as a poster board presentation to the class with images, as I've chosen there, very carefully selected to represent their deep layer change dates. You could use it as paired, and I should have put individual work. Of course, it could be assigned as for individual work as well as paired work. It could be an in-class assignment or a weekly assignment. It could also be presented as a culminating exercise to chapters. Students will also find more than one deep layer change presented in a chapter. So you could tell them to find 2 or 3 different deep layer changes if you wanted to. Okay, that concludes this part 2 of Deep Layered Change. I hope you found it useful and interesting, whether or not you're an instructor of history or a student of history. And should you like to contact me, I'd be happy to communicate with you via the contact information that you will find on the last slide of this video.